بشنو از نی چون حکایت میکند، از جدایی شکایت میکند. کاز نیستن چون مرا ببریده اند، از نفیرم مرد و زن نالیده اند. Listen to the song of the reed in its weeping, for it tells the story of our separation. For since the day the reed was torn from its riverbank, in its sorrow is heard the cry of every man, of every woman. Once there was a poet called Abu Sher, a poet so famous that his verses were sung at the banquet tables of princes and kings. A poet so famous that even the shepherds recited his verses to their flock of sheep to make them go to sleep. A poet so famous that every evening he was invited to the Padshah's palace, and there that evening in the palace gardens he would recite his poetry to the king and his courtiers, after which the king would shower this poet with many golden coins and sweets. And this happened night after night. The afternoon, the poet waited for anticipation for that royal invitation that would lead him that night once again to recite his beautiful poetry underneath a sky of moon and stars. But a day came when he didn't receive that invitation. Oh, he waited for the sun to set, and yet still there was not a herald coming from the king announcing that royal invitation. And it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Days and weeks passed, and despite all his waiting, the poet, not once did he receive that royal invitation. And darkness came before his eyes. His heart became as heavy as a stone, as he asked himself again and again, what after all has happened? What have I done wrong? Does the king no longer have gratitude? Does the king no longer have gratitude for my poetry? And so he came up with a plan. He would write a panegyric. He would write a poem of praise for his king. And indeed, with such a poem, he would win the heart once again of his beloved king. And so for weeks, the poet chased the most choicest of metaphors. For weeks, the poet wrestled with rhyme and verse to create the most perfect poem that ever was. A poem of music unparalleled in this world. A poem in praise of his king. And at once he sent that poem to the vizier, the minister of the king. And he waited. He waited days. He waited weeks. And yet there was still no answer. Had the king not read his poem? And so at once he went before the vizier, and he asked him what had become of that poem, that panegyric, that poem of praise for his king. And the vizier smiled at the poet. Indeed, I delivered your poem with my own hands to the king, the vizier explained to him. And I saw how carefully the king read your poem. His eyes began to well with tears as he exclaimed, Indeed, indeed, this poet must have many friends he does not even know about, many friends who have been joyed at these verses that he offers to the world. O great poet, if you could only see how moved the king was at the poem that you offered him. Well, all this time the poet listened quietly, but he did not believe a word. This cannot be, said the poet to the vizier, for if indeed what you say is true, the king would have sent me an invitation long ago. You're lying to me. You're lying to me. And so the poet left the vizier, his heart enraged, for he imagined the king and the vizier were laughing behind his back. And his heart was filled with such rage, such bitterness, that he decided then and there that he would unleash a poet's most lethal weapon. He would unleash satire. And so at once he set to writing a satirical poem. And he found the words that were so cutting that they would cut everyone and everything, every belief to nothing. As he wrote that poem, he mistook his own cruelty for cleverness, as his malice poured from his pen as he wrote that satirical poem, filled with all his bitterness. And at once he had that satire, that satirical poem circulated throughout the city. And when it reached the taverns, there were many there who saw their own bitterness in the bitterness that poured from that satire. And they began to celebrate that satirical poem. It began to earn no small degree of notoriety as it began to be recited throughout the city, within the earshot of the king's own guards, where there it was recited throughout that city, that cruel poem, that satire the poet had written against his own king. And soon the whole town was talking about that satirical poem, so much that even the king could not ignore all the talk that he was hearing around him. And yet all that time he was silent until his vizier approached him. Your Majesty, he said, after all, you must do something. For all this malicious talk, they will sow the seeds of sedition. Your subjects will rise up against you as they read the malice that pours from this poem. You must do something. You must do something to punish this poet. But the king only listened silently, and he replied to his vizier with this sad smile. Alas, he said to him, this poet of mine thinks that I have lost my gratitude for him. And yet he does not understand. He does not understand that I still hold my gratitude. For my gratitude is in the pleasure I take in his poetry. My gratitude is the joy that he has in sharing the world what he has to offer. My gratitude is in our shared joy of poetry itself. But alas, the poet doesn't understand this, and he has fallen into this bitterness, this unhappiness. How I feel such sorrow for him at the moment. Well, all this time the vizier was listening to this, but then he turned to the king and he said, that may very well be so. But what will you do with this contempt against you that's spreading across your city, spreading across your very own kingdom? But to this the king replied, my dear vizier, Do not worry about this contempt. For do you not understand that contempt can endure anything? Contempt can endure anything except being ignored. Do not say a word of this contempt, and I will say even less. Let the contempt run its course until it's bored with its own malice, and it will slowly die away. And so that is what the king did. And indeed what the king said had been true, for some weeks had passed, and all the talk had died down. All the people who found bitterness in that satirical poem came to a point where they became bored with it, and so they found other places in which to find their own malice, and let that poet and his satirical poem fall into neglect. And then once again, the poet found himself once again ignored for long stretches of days, of weeks, of months. But this time, it was filled with even more bitterness, for through that time he understood how much he betrayed himself, in writing that satirical poem, how much he sacrificed the better part of himself only for the sake of appearing clever. Oh, and the terrible remorse that fell on that poet. It was unbearable. Now it seemed that there was nothing that could console him. But after some weeks, the poet one day saw, standing at his front door, a herald from the king. This herald had in his hands a box of sandalwood, which he offered the poet. And when the poet opened that box, he saw it was filled with gold coins. Oh, how he had waited for those gold coins for all that time of neglect. He had lost all his money, and now these riches had come just at the right time. But he saw at the bottom of the box there was a folded piece of paper. And when he removed that paper and unfolded it, he saw written in the hand of the king himself one of his poems that the king had copied by his own hand. It was one of his first poems and one of his best. It was one of his poems where he put the better part of himself in every line. And as he read that poem written by the king himself, his eyes welled with tears as he said this to himself: "Indeed, I have been wrong all along, for the king not once has lost his gratitude for my poetry, for his gratitude has always been in the joy he takes in my poetry. His gratitude has always been in the joy I take in sharing with the world what I have to offer. His gratitude has always been in the shared poetry, in the shared love, in the shared joy of poetry itself." بشنو از نی چون حکایت میکند، از جدایی شکایت میکند. Listen to the song of the reed in its weeping, for it tells the story of our separation.